What is up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and the goal of the Practical SQL Server HA show is to provide insights, tips, hacks into making your SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery implementations practical. And it's not just about technology. In fact, if you go back to all of the episodes, I focus more on the non-technical aspects, mainly because we technical professionals get so fixated on the tech that we tend to forget there are things that are more important than tech, right? This episode is what I call going back to the basics. In fact, I'm going to put my slide on the screen, and I'm going to call this SMH. I'm going to be flipping back and forth between my slides and my camera. This is something that I did more than a decade ago now. Yeah, more than a decade ago now. When I started doing workshops on SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery. But beyond just talking about the technical aspects, the features like availability groups, failover clustering, log shipping, database mirroring, what else? Backups, restore, all of that stuff, is I make sure that I incorporate the people in the process aspect of high availability and disaster recovery, because these are key. They're very important, and this is going back to the basics. 10 years ago, when I included this topic, I called it something different. I took the idea from the Narnia movies, the very first one, I think the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then I just changed the witch to switch to mean something else, and came up with this concept. And I figured, well, that's kind of an old movie. Maybe some of you guys have not seen it yet, but I took a completely different approach, but still addressing the same concept, or showcasing and teaching the same concept. So let's get back into SMH. SMH is what I call the who and the what of HADR, right? The who and the what of HADR. Every letter in SMH stands for something. And again, these are things that are very important in our implementation of high availability and disaster recovery solutions that sometimes we technical professionals forget. So grab your pen and paper, start taking notes. Again, we're going to go back to the basics here. Let's get on with the presentation. S. What does S stand for? S stands for that other storage. That other storage. And I don't mean your hard drives, or I don't mean digital storage media. I don't mean your magnetic tapes. I don't mean your IO Mega drives. If you guys are still using IO Mega drives or zip drives, I don't mean that. I mean, what I mean in that other storage are things that contain data and information that we need when implementing and or maintaining, supporting, operating, monitoring, administering, troubleshooting your availabilities, high availability and disaster recovery solutions. So what is that other storage? There are a few. In fact, the first one is that runbook and documentation. Runbook and documentation. Because no one likes writing documentation. And right, it's interesting because I threw that in here because, for one, we do not like writing documentation. We'd rather do something, right? We want to get our hands dirty, implement the solution, try new features, and then roll it out in production. Oh, and by the way, we need to write documentation. Ugh. Writing documentation is a necessary evil. I do not like writing documentation, but then I realized, wait, what if I'm not around? What if I'm on vacation? What if I needed to be away for some time, and maybe I'm traveling and then I'm on a totally different time zone, and then something went wrong and nobody knows what to do, right? And this is one of those things that I've learned working as a data center engineer, because back then I was working in Singapore, and every once in a while I would travel to Seattle at the Microsoft campus, and those are two different time zones. And so while I may be a senior escalation engineer, I could not be available 24/7. So I needed to come up with something, in this case, written documentation, in order for me to provide guidance to whoever is going to be part of the operations team, right? Do you even have one? That's a very, very important question. Do you even have a documentation in place? Like I said, we technical professionals don't like writing documentation. So even having one is a big deal. Yes. Like I said, I didn't like writing documentation, but I knew it's a necessary evil. So I started writing documentation in order for me to hand it off to the operations team. Now, there are two categories. The way I look at it, there are two categories of documentation. One is a build documentation. This is where I'm taking screenshots, I'm giving instructions, steps, config, whatever setup I need to do as part of my production build. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that I have consistent documentation for both UAT, staging, production, and DR, as well as if things go south, meaning even though we have DR, we need to rebuild the production data center from scratch. This is something that we did back in those days where something went wrong with production. We needed to fail over to DR, had the workloads running in the DR, and then rebuild production. If we did not have a build documentation in place, I'm just going to be guessing. So I do not expect to be using the build documentation as frequent as I need to. In fact, I would build one for UAT, use that as a basis for building staging, use the same documentation as the basis for building production, which is good because now I'm doing multiple environments for one build documentation, and all I really needed to do was change host names, change IP addresses, change some config, but basically the environments look the same on UAT, staging, and production, and all I had to do is copy and paste the UAT build documentation to have 3, and then just do a find and replace. And of course, making sure that I actually walk through the process of going through the build documentation as I'm actually building the new environments, staging, production, and DR, right? Do you even have one? That's a very important thing to know, right? Is it updated? Oof. With all the different things happening as part of day-to-day operations. So by the way, I did say there are two categories. One is the build documentation and the other is the operational documentation, which includes what do you need to do when you're doing X. For example, how do you perform patching for a failover clustered instance or an availability group or a database mirroring? So there are step-by-step processes on how to do X, whatever that X is. Or what do we need to do if we need to replace hard drive or replace a node or evict a node, all of that kind of stuff. So that's part of the operational documentation or runbook. But having said that, part of that is also keeping the document updated. For instance, if you started off with a physical machine for your availability groups and all of a sudden you decide, hey, we want to move that the availability group to VMs, is the build documentation still referring to physical machines? Because I'm pretty sure you are not going to be updating hardware firmware when you're on VMs, right? So it has to be updated. And this is part of your change management process. It has to be included as part of your change management process. Let's say, for instance, you're making modification to your existing solution. Again, I'll use availability groups or available clustered instances as an example, and you tweak a setting. Maybe because an example that I could think of is you're doing a re-IP, meaning reassigning new IP addresses because the network is growing and now you have to come up with new IP addresses for your listener name, for your failover clustered instance network name. Did you update the build documentation to reflect the new IP addresses? Or, again, adding a new node, removing a new node, moving the node to a different network subnet, all of these things, so long as it is a major config change, you need to update the build documentation. And again, it's pretty difficult to keep track of all of these changes. So why not include this as part of your change management process? You change a config, and then you update the document. I know it is going to take time doing the change and changing the documentation or updating documentation. But the worst situation to be in is rebuilding everything from the ground up because there's an emergency and a junior staff is on call or the only person available, and they're following an outdated documentation. Clearly, they might not be able to do what they need to do at that point, right? So ask the question, is the documentation even updated? Is it written properly? Didn't I say we don't like writing documentation? For one, they didn't teach us technical writing in college. Or maybe they did. I don't know. Computer science. Did they? I don't know. I don't have a computer science degree. But the mistake that most people, especially people who are intermediate to senior level engineers, is that they write the documentation for themselves. So they use acronyms that only they could understand. They would use naming conventions that only they could understand. And they would start incorporating stuff that only they could understand. My rule of thumb for this is let the most senior engineer write the documentation and let the most junior engineer test whether or not the documentation is useful. And what I mean by useful is, can the most junior engineer on staff follow along the documentation, do what is what is outlined in the documentation, and can they actually do what's expected of them just by simply following the documentation? It's also a good opportunity for training and knowledge transfer for the junior staff, because now they're following along, and in the process, they may have questions. They may have questions about the config. They may have questions about why something is done the way it was done. And then, based on the documentation, you can tweak, making sure that the written documentation, of course, typed whatever, making sure that the written documentation is easily understood by the most junior engineer, or the most junior staff, right? Again, is it properly written, or is it written properly? Is it readily available? Meaning, can I access the document? In today's day and age of digital documentation, wiki, Word documents, PDF, it's tempting for us to simply come up with a documentation, put it on a Word document, and then upload it to a central repository like Google Drive, OneDrive, or SharePoint, whether it's on premises or online. But the thing about this is, what happens if in an emergency situation, your entire production data center went offline for God knows what happened, natural disasters, and your documentation is on your production SharePoint server. You've written it properly, it's updated, you have one, but you can't access the documentation. I know for a fact that, in my case, I don't like printing documents because I want to save more trees. I don't want to kill more trees, and if I can avoid that, it's interesting because we started digitizing stuff, but yet we are printing more documents, right? I don't like printing documentation. Again, I want to save Mother Earth, I want to save more trees. But if that's the only way for me to have a copy of the documentation, so be it. I actually don't like printing. So what I'll do is I'll take a copy of the documentation, put it on a USB stick or a removable storage that is not part of the production environment where you're hosting your digital documents. The thing about this is you also have to practice due diligence as far as securing those documents. You don't want your build documentation or your runbook with config information, IP addresses, intellectual property information to just be sitting on a hard drive that is not encrypted, that is is laying around, right? You have to practice due diligence on protecting the document. But the key thing here is making sure that the document is readily available, whether you're printing off the document or you're copying it off to a storage media or digital removable storage media. Make sure that it is readily available. The challenge when you're printing a document is you may have printed it 1 year ago, which no longer looks like how your existing infrastructure or your solution looks like today. So now you are tempted to start checking and updating the document and printing documents as you're changing something in the document, which is, again, killing more trees. Please do not. If you can avoid it, don't print. I don't know, maybe it's just me, right? So, runbook, is it readily available? Backups is another thing, right? This is one of those storage that you have to think about. One, where are they stored? Do you know? Where are your backup media stored? And this becomes even more complicated and confusing, especially in large organizations where you have siloed teams where the sysadmins are taking care of the backups. They have an enterprise backup solution. They install the SQL Server backup agent, whatever that backup agent is, on your SQL Server instances, and then they would do the backups from the enterprise backup solution, stream that over, and then they would take everything, put it on tape, ship it off to a remote facility. But the question still remains, do you know where your backups are? There will be people who would say, sure, put those backups on local storage first and then copy them off. But this is, again, a question of who's taking the backups. Is it the DBA or is it the sysadmin where they're using third-party enterprise backup tool, shipping off the copy of the backup somewhere, right? Because part of that is going to impact your recovery time objective. If it is going to take a couple of hours to retrieve the backup, if that requires talking to the enterprise backup team, whom, if you're working for a large corporation, talking to the enterprise backup team who could be somewhere, not necessarily within the same location as you. So it could be challenging, right? Where are they stored? And do you have access to these backups? Like I said, this is part of your overall policy, internal policy, and your strategies on how you take backups, whether they're native SQL Server backups or third-party backups. The biggest challenge that I see here is when SQL Server is running on a VM, and then the VM admins are taking care of the backups, and those backups are streamed over to a central backup location, which the DBA has no access to, right? But it's not taking SQL Server backups. It's taking VM snapshots or VM backups, which is the copy of the VM at that point when the snapshot was taken. So it's not just affecting your recovery time objective, it's also affecting your recovery point objective, because how often are they taking those backups, right? And again, do you have access? I remember the time when we were taking backups, we were using enterprise backups, but I told the enterprise backup team I will be using native SQL Server backups, automated native SQL Server backups, dump them on the local drive or local disk, let the enterprise backup take those, and then copy them over to tape, where the tapes will be stored at an off-site location, a couple of kilometers. Yes, I use kilometers, not miles. A couple of kilometers away from our data center. Just, again, part of the policy where if something goes wrong with our production data center, our backups are off-site. But then part of the policy is also putting them in a secure off-site location where we need to follow security protocols and policies just to access those backups. Where we needed to file for a security request to the security officer just to access those backups, where if If those backups were encrypted, we still need to request for decryption of those backups. Part of those, because if I don't have access to those backups as a DBA, what happens to my recovery time objective? Because your recovery time objective starts counting the minute that the server, the database, the app, or whatever goes offline, right? The clock is ticking. You need to be aware of that. Who do you need to talk to get access to have access to those backups? Are they encrypted? Are they somewhere where you have access? Or if not, who do you need to talk to in order to have access? Or if they're not giving you access because of some security policies, how fast can they come back to you with a copy of the backups that they can restore on the local disk so that you can use those to restore the databases? Okay, so again, understanding whether or not you know where they're stored and whether or not you have access, right? And are they properly labeled? Whew. Are they? There's a reason why when SQL Server creates database backups using either database maintenance plan or even all Hallingren scripts, there's a reason why the file name has the format year, month, day, hour, minute, second, and that's because part of that is just human nature. We get confused, right? But with the proper labeling, at one glance, if you know the standard naming convention, it's easy to spot the latest one. Okay? It's easy to spot the latest full database backup instead of scrambling around and figuring out which one's the latest. The last thing you want is you're cutting tight on your recovery time objective and then grabbing a copy of the backup, restoring it, took 4 hours to restore, where your recovery time is 5 hours. Not realizing it was the wrong backup, right? Not realizing it was the wrong backup. Same thing. One of the reasons why it is not a recommended best practice to append backups in a single storage media, because in a real disaster, if you're not in the right state of mind, it becomes easy to get confused with which backup are you working on. Learn it the hard way. I was restoring serious transaction log backups, and all of a sudden, oops, one was incorrect, so I have to go and rewind my restore. I have to scramble. And this is, again, the part where you have to think about, how can I automate this so that I can go through the restore process as quickly as I possibly can and not have to worry about the naming convention, because if I'm the one reading it and I get confused, that's the clock ticking and it's adding up to the recovery time objective. Okay. Do they even work? Do your backups even work? You've heard me tell the story of one case that I worked on a couple of years ago, where during an assessment exercise, I saw that there were database corruptions happening on one of the databases. It showed up on the SQL Server error log, and confident as I was, I asked for the latest backup. They gave me the latest backup, not realizing that the latest database backup had a copy of the corrupted database. No problem. Asked for 1 day old, meaning not today's, but yesterday's backup. Still contained a copy of the corrupted database. Okay. What about from last week? Still contained a copy of the corrupted database. Same thing with last month, up until like 8 months. They have been taking database backups for 8 months, and nobody was checking whether or not the backups actually work. That's how I ended up with this controversial statement where I don't really believe in backups. I don't, because of that incident. What I believe in is successfully testing whether or not your backups actually work. And the only way to find out is to do a restore. Right? So don't ever make that mistake of assuming that your backups actually work. Test them, right? Test your backups. What else? Installation media. What for? Well, stuff like, I want to pause here for a second and talk about when you're rebuilding a server from scratch, you're assuming that you have everything that you need. If it's a physical machine that you're trying to rebuild, you have the operating system installation media, SQL Server installation media, cumulative updates, the latest ones, or if you're still on 2016 and older service packs, security patches for Windows, all of these things. And not just that, you may, let me throw that in there, drivers, firmware. Again, if you're building a physical machine from the ground up, how sure are you that you have access to the HBA driver or the network adapter driver? Or if you're using an HSM or hardware security module, do you have a driver for that? What else? Apps connecting to the databases using either an ODBC or JDBC driver. Do you have access to those? Because you need to install those as well. And this is going back to part of the storage where you have documentation, right? If it's not in the documentation, then how would you know that you need to install the firmwares, the drivers as part of rebuilding the servers? Okay. And the most important storage, the way I look at it, the most important storage of all is you. Yes, you. What do you know that you haven't documented yet? And like I said, we don't like writing documentation. And as technical professionals, you accumulate knowledge watching YouTube videos of somebody doing it, taking courses, reading blog posts, and a lot of those have gone into implementation of your HADR solutions to a point where part of your setup, part of your config is a byproduct of you learning all of these things. There are institutional wisdom. And what I mean by institutional wisdom is you've been working in a company for a decade or more, and you've accumulated a lot of that stuff. Have you transfer that knowledge or institutional knowledge to the team? Because you might retire in a few months, or you might decide to move on to a better paying job, maybe. If you have not documented those, or you have not shared that information to your colleagues or the junior engineers, you'll be scrambling at the last day of work, trying to write. And I've seen this happen over and over and over again, where somebody had been working for the company for 5 years, 10 years, and then all of a sudden they decide, I want to move on to a better paying job or a better company, or I just want to try something else. They moved on, and the last 3 weeks, so sometimes they would give in 4 weeks notice, and during those 4 weeks, it's all handing off stuff that they've done because they did not document, they did not share institutional knowledge to their colleagues. So the 4 weeks of a notice period is spent doing things that we don't really like doing, like writing documentation and transferring knowledge. So again, what do you know that you haven't documented yet? And this, again, this goes beyond technical knowledge, even institutional knowledge. Keep in mind, you're not going to be there forever. You will retire, you will move on to a better paying job, whatever. Transfer that institutional knowledge as early as now. Schedule brown bag sessions with your colleagues. Even if your team is remote, you can do that via Zoom session, a Slack meeting, GoToMeeting, Teams, whatever. Okay? Just make sure that that knowledge, that institutional knowledge, or the way you set up and why you do what you do when you're doing troubleshooting, when you're doing monitoring, maintenance, and all of these things are not just documented, but also giving them insights as to why something is done. I remember one case that I worked on a couple of years ago where the engineers built a failover clustered instance, and this was already running SQL Server 2014. And I asked the question, why is the cluster built this way? I'm just curious because, again, seeing those patterns, one guy said, well, the senior engineer who used to, and the keyword is used to, who used to work here, built this. And this was how he did for all the failover clusters. And then he took that same institutional knowledge from all of these, and nobody knows why he built it this way. right? Because that becomes a part of your operational procedures with that institutional knowledge. And some people would just build something because that's how they've done it in the past, not realizing there's a better way of doing things. Okay, so again, make sure that you have documented and shared what you know as far as the whole HADR solution is concerned. Share it with your team, the most junior guy, most senior guy. And this is a non-stop thing. It's a continuous thing because, again, people come and go, and you want to make sure that everybody on your team, whether new or old, are aware of how the whole setup was done, whether it's you or somebody else, because again, it's information being passed on from one engineer to another engineer, and unless it's properly documented, it stays right here, and then you leave, and when you leave, nobody knows, right? We've covered S, and that's just S, storage. There's so many things that you can think of as far as storage. I've covered the most important ones. Runbooker documentation, backups, where it is stored, firmwares, drivers, installation media. You have to have those ready in order for you to be ready. Collect those, write the documentation, store them in a place where you can have immediately get them access or immediate get access, because you'll never know when a natural calamity, a natural disaster, or a real disaster would strike that would force you to use all of those. Okay. Part one, this is just part one of this series. And like I said, this is going back to the basics. We are looking at SMH, part one. S, where we talked about the storage, that other storage. In the next series or the next part of the series, I will be covering the M. Again, with the context of the who and the what of HADR. Well, you kind of get a sense of what the M and the H is, because it's a who and a what, right? So tune in again next episode next time for another episode of Practical SQL Server HADR show, where we are going to continue on this Back to Basics series and talking about SMH, the who and the what of HADR. And if you need help, if let's say you're building you're thinking about building a high availability and disaster recovery solution, you're looking at evaluating an existing HADR solution, reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. And these strategy sessions are designed to get clear on what the goal is. And most of the time I ask the recovery time objective questions because I want to get clear on what the real goal is, how critical the system is, right? Before you even decide this is the solution that we want, because we want to make sure that the solution that you eventually implement meets the ultimate goal, right? Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have a conversation, and I look forward to having that talk with you, all right? Again, tune in for part 2 of this Back to Basics series. I'll see you again next time. Enjoy the rest of your week.